All right. I will go through these first slides again, but I'll try and be a little more concise. Hello, my name is Joel Berger, and I am with the Mojolicious Web Framework project. We just recently released our 9.0 release. I assume most of you are familiar with what Mojolicious is, as this is a Perlmongers meeting, but just quickly, Mojolicious is a real-time web framework, and Mojo is a web development toolkit. And the two obviously design together and work together, but you can find out more about us at mojolicious.org, including all other contact information. And if this were a more introductory talk, which are the kind of talks I usually give, I would just describe it a little bit more, but we're going to move on to the changes here. Oh, and see also my announcement blog post on my Mojolicious blog, mojolicious.org. Gosh, tripping over words now. And it should be the top post on that as of right now. Every release of Mojolicious has a code name, and those code names are based on Unicode characters. 9.0 is lovingly named Waffle. And here you can see the previous code names, starting with Snowflake. I joined around the Rainbow release cycle, and we are now all the way up to 9.0 Waffle. You can see the code points there beyond them. And on to the changes. One of the biggest things so far, one of the biggest things you might have noticed is that Mojolicious requires Perl 5.16 now. That gave us a few internal features that were really helpful, including the subtoken, which is really awesome for doing asynchronous programming because of the way you can refer to the subroutine that you are currently in by a token. This isn't probably our last bump of Mojo version. I kind of consider this a trial run for a bump to 5.20. When eventually Perl's native signatures become non-experimental, we will probably start using the signatures in the core code itself, and that will require 5.20 at least. One of the nice things, though, I say, you may have noticed this, we actually have not heard much complaint from the community, so I hope that that means that many people were already using at least Perl version 5.16. That makes me happy. Obviously, Mojolicious is a asynchronous loop-based web framework, and we added some really awesome asynchronous functionality in the 9.0 development series. I say 9.0 development series because actually we added async await quite early in the 8.xx, but we highlight everything that happened since then, and this certainly needs another highlighting because we have now async await baked into the Mojolicious code. It requires Paul Evans, otherwise known as Leonard's, future async await as of version 3.0.36. It doesn't actually use the futures promises. It uses the native Mojolicious promise library, but we have all the right hooks. He's worked with us to make this work correctly. And when you do that, you get two new keywords in your code, async and await. And these keywords behave like you might know them from other language. But if you aren't aware of what those are, it gives you a procedural style code flow, except that this is for asynchronous code. You don't have to do callbacks. You don't even really have to think about promises too much, depending on what you're doing. And you still get your standard exception handling with, eval or try catch or however you're doing your exception handling in Perl. One of the nicest things for me, and I like to highlight this, is a lot of people got confused doing async both with callbacks and with promises. But with async await, you can have a really trivial asynchronous recipe to help you do asynchronous programming. And the key is if you simply use the await keyword on any function that returns a promise. And then secondly, you mark any function wherein you use that await keyword, you mark that function as async. And I'll show you how this looks in a second. But with those two rules, you basically get asynchronous development for free. And that's all you really have to think about in most cases. I added number 3 here, which is remember that all of your asynchronous functions now return promises, so you have to await those as well. But that's just sort of part of what async await does. Here's your example. We import async await to get that functionality, and you see that it brings me the await keywords. And because I've used the await keyword, I have to use the async keyword here. That's my recipe. These 2 functions here return promises, and those promises represent what will happen at the end of requesting those URLs. You'll notice there's no callbacks. There's no callback signatures you have to worry about or any of that things. You just get back the transaction for each request, and you can do post-processing, and you can render some result based on it. It's entirely baked into the Mojolicious runtime. You don't have to think about it at all. And the benefit of doing that is your server can continue to serve other client requests while it's waiting for the responses from those external services. You'll notice that I was using that in controller code. Another nice thing here is that controller actions that return promises, like I said, all async methods return a promise, but controller actions that return promises will get proper error handling in a way like if you remember the old delay helper, and it's okay if you don't, but we had handling that would tie, like if you had an exception in your controller code inside of the delay helper, it would properly pass that through to the client. We now again have that with a promise. So if your controller returns a promise, and all async controllers do that, it will just work as it should. I guess I probably could have phrased that slide a little bit better. Sorry about that. What I mean to say is that there's proper error handling. If something part of this throws an error, your client will get the proper message. Some addendums to that recipe, because that is a pretty trivial recipe. If you want to take it just a hair further, if you want to do requests in parallel, you don't want to await each promise, say any or all settled, or things that can do other behavior. But in this case, this would say when all of those settle, then, or when all of those succeed, then give me the results. Second recipe addendum, if you aren't in a Mojolicious web app, you may have to start the loop yourself. In that case, it's really no harder than just making an async sub called main, calling main, oh gosh, and setting up an error handler and calling wait on it. This is the simple way of doing that. Moving away from async await a little bit, as I mentioned briefly, we've added new promise class methods, including all settled and any, which are like all, except all settled will just wait for all of the promises to either succeed or fail, and any will wait until a single one succeeds. We have a new function called map, or a method called map, which I won't explain in detail here, but just know that you can use map to limit the concurrency level if you want to make, say, 5 requests at a time and work through a list of 100 things to do. Map is what you want to look at. And we've added little conveniences, timer and timeout. So timer succeeds after n seconds, and timeout fails after n seconds. You need to have something monitor your process or do something at a certain time. Some new promise behaviors. Unhandled rejected promises warn when the promise object is destroyed. This is a lot like you see in the browser. And it really helps you when something is going wrong and you're not, a thing that can often happen with promises is your errors are sort of swallowed, and you can't, if you don't know where the problem is, you don't know where to attach error handling. Probably you missed it somewhere, but you don't see it. This is a really wonderful functionality where if you haven't handled a rejected promise, it will at least tell you something in your console. Log, I shouldn't say log out, but standard error. And the constructor has been changed a little bit to look more like the JavaScript constructor. Just helps people migrate back into Perl from JavaScript if that's where they've been living for a while. Moving even further away, we've added a focus on containerization and cloud deployments. We've decided really to care to make it easy for people to use Mojolicious in containerized and cloud environments. One of the first things we've done is we've added a deployment-specific plugin handling. And it's basically still like plugins that you're used to, except these are plugins that you can load from configuration. And you might ask why you do that. Well, imagine you're trying to deploy a prepackaged application. You shouldn't need to ask the developer of the application to add some plugin that's mostly for deployment. In this example here, we're doing site user group, which does, starts up the application using one user, but say to get privileged ports, but then downgrades you to have a less privileged user as it's running. That's not something that your end user application needs to care about, but you would still want to know how to set those things later on. A feature that I added, and I'm really proud of, we've always had this Mojo reverse proxy handling. Here I'm showing it to you in the environment variable form because a lot of times this will come up inside of container environments where people are likely to pass environment variables. But the reverse proxy method would only let you say, please look in the appropriate headers, look up one proxy jump, and trust me that that one proxy jump is my external client address. And that was fine when you were maybe doing one Nginx proxy at your host, but many people now have several proxies. Maybe they're doing an upstream proxy like Cloudflare in front of some of their other services, or maybe they're using Kubernetes where you're going to have possibly several proxies to get to your actual service. This lets you say, please trust all of these known proxies, and then give me the client information beyond that one, without trying to guess how many hops up you have, where that guessing can be really insecure. So if this sounds interesting to you, please look up Mojo Trusted Proxies in the documentation, and you'll read more there. For example, I have links here to show, but I think we're just going to assume that you guys know that the major proxying services have published lists of IPs that their requests may come from. And if you include those in your application, you can safely proxy from them. Obviously, the world is moving toward the YAML direction, and people are, for better or worse, I love YAML, but I know some people hate it. Either way, we've added a YAML config loader so that if you already have tons of YAML in your code base for Kubernetes or for Docker Compose or things, you have a way to do YAML in your Mojolicious config. We've called it not YAML because it technically isn't perfectly YAML compliant. It's very close. But if you care about the difference there, we also have pluggable backends, so you can use some YAML module from CPAN. We've added some generators and recipes. We've added a Docker file generator. If you can do my app, so you're building something, my app generate Docker file, it will build you a little rudimentary Docker file for you. We've added a containerization cookbook recipe, and we've added a cookbook recipe for the Envoy cloud native proxy. I've been thinking about doing a recipe for traffic, but we haven't added that yet. But these are the kind of things we're thinking about to help people use Mojolicious in these environments. Beyond just those documentation updates, we've made other documentation updates. We've made a new look for the Mojolicious documentation renderer and for the built-in templates for the 404 and 500 pages. Given that this is not the streaming system I'm used to, I'm a little afraid to click away from them. But go take a look at docs.mojolicious.org. It's a beautiful rendering of our documentation. And we all know and love the 404 and 500 pages. So specifically for development, where it shows you more stuff about what has gone wrong. And these new pages are prettier. We use Highlight.js now instead of the old Google one that is not maintained. So your code highlighting is nicer, and those pages are all responsive, so you can look at them on mobile. We are encouraging signatures. It feels like I spelled that word wrong, but whatever. We're encouraging signatures in our documentation and in our project generators. Some form of native Perl signatures are coming. Yes, we know that they are still technically experimental, but I think we're all in high hopes that that will become non-experimental soon, in more or less the form we have them. Some changes in routing and a little bit in rendering. A big change that some people will notice is you can no longer use reserved stash values in your placeholders. So if you wanted to route to / the controller name / the action name, we no longer allow that. And the biggest reason is, while a few people understood how to do that, even if you understood how to do it, you probably weren't doing it quite right, and you were leaving yourself open to some security vulnerabilities. We never really encouraged this in the last several releases, but we finally made it an error. You can't even do this. If you want to do something like this, it does not take much extra code to make it work. But we don't think, too often people who were trying to do this did it wrong, and we just don't want you to try and do it unless you really know what you're doing. Better routing and rendering errors. If you're missing a controller, you'll get an exception when you're missing a controller, or a controller without the requested action, or when auto rendering fails, or when the render cannot render a response. These things used to either trigger sort of timeouts or 404 pages when it's really an error. And we went through and cleaned up that those all really should be errors that you can see. We know now how to properly detect when most of the things you're trying to do are doing, say, long-running async requests. We don't have to just let it sit there and time out. We can give you an exception in most cases. So hopefully that will help people get better diagnostics, especially when developing. We did a few simplifications and renamings. There were two methods in the router that you can do different ways. Detour, I don't even want to explain to you how people would have used detour before. If you really need it, you can still use the partial command. Believe me, most people watching this don't care about this. There was a route method called route that existed to build sort of an abstract route. It's basically a duplicate of the any constructor, which a lot of you are probably using. And so we just said, you know what, we don't need a separate constructor for that route. So route is gone, just use any instead. We renamed two things because they were confusing to people. Yes, it broke a little bit of code, but we hope that this will make these two methods a little more self-explanatory. Via, which used to be how you would choose, oh, I want to let this route handle get and post, but not put and delete. That thing is now called methods. Much clearer name, much clearer intent of what it does. Over is now called requires. Over and require, well, now requires, has conditional routing. So if you need a routing condition to be on, say, a header or something, over didn't mean anything, and in my opinion, had a weird symmetry with the under command, which still does exist. That symmetry was never real. There's no reason those two things, under and over, sounded like they were similar. They're very different, and this now makes it clear that those are very different, and I hope this will end some confusion people have had. A thing I'm pretty proud of, because I helped set this up, the documentation site, docs.mojolicious.org, is now auto-built whenever we push to master of Mojolicious or MojoPG or Minion, or I think a few other things now. That is built by GitHub Actions. It is sent to the Docker GitHub Docker registry, and then it is deployed on our servers via Kubernetes. automatically, and it's really neat. So we don't have to worry about keeping the documentation in sync. It just keeps itself in sync. You always get the latest documentation right away. A cool feature here, I see it's already noon. I'll try and skim through this quickly. Logging, we've added some logging features, a contextual logger, which was always hard to do in an asynchronous web framework we have. We still have the global logger, the same thing you've always been doing, but we now have these what we call child loggers. If you do log as a helper on a controller, you get a child logger from the global logger, which contains the current request ID. And so hopefully that can make your log messages just a little bit clearer when you read them. Several log messages, oh, these were all from request ID, blah. And if you need to make a sublogger, a child logger with your own context, you can pull it out of the main logger by calling context. And what you get is a child logger instance that is still a Mojo log instance, but now has whatever context you want to have in your log messages. You also have a thing that I know we could do in Python, which is your logger can have a subreference, and only if you satisfy the logging requirement, so I'm in debug mode, only then does it actually call this to generate the log message. So if you're logging strings, you probably don't care about this, but if you have to build some expensive log output and you only want to do it if you're in the right mode, then this is for you. And we noticed that our own internal performance increased by 10% when we added this functionality. We've also simplified. The logger used to care if you had a path called log in your current working directory, and that just, we've simplified that. You always get a logging to standard error by default. You can obviously still set a path in your logger, but you have to do that manually. That was just a source of confusion to people. We've made it simpler. Proxy helpers, I'll just show you the quick example. If you need to make a request on behalf of your client and then pass the results of that back to the client, you can use this new proxy method. So your controller is getting Mojolicious.org, and assuming everything works, we'll just pass the results of that back to the client that you're serving for. Obviously, you can handle a promise failure by rendering something else. If that sounds interesting to you, go look that up. I'm really excited about some new Mojo DOM CSS selectors. Note that these selectors are all CSS4, so until CSS4 is stable, we're calling these experimental, but hopefully they stay around. Here's the first one is the has pseudo class. So has lets you conditionally match an element based on a property of its children. One thing that CSS selectors can only, so far, have only been able to let you pick sort of the result of your, oh, here, I'll show you. Imagine you need to match all anchors that contain images. You could use one of these two. This one says anchors that directly contain images, and this is one that says anchors that contain an image somewhere down its child tree. But if you did this, what you got as your result was the image tag. And so if what you wanted was the anchor tag, you had to now walk back up the parent until you found the anchor that you cared about. That's not impossible, but it's certainly not interesting, and it's not semantically what you were asking for. So with has, you can now say, I'm interested in the anchor. And the anchor which has the property of having a direct child of image or having a direct child, having an indirect child that's an image. But your result will be this anchor, because this is you can see how it looks like a class, right? It looks like a pseudo class. And that can just really simplify your code when you're trying to extract things that way. You'll notice that it has kind of this weird property of a character just hanging out, and that's because implicitly what you're saying is there's a scope token, and that scope is, in this case, the anchor. So if anchor with a direct child of image matches, And the reason this is nice is you can actually move this. So you can have the has somewhere in the has selector scope in somewhere in this has selector that is not immediately in the front, and create some really interesting selectors that way. One other one is the is pseudoclass. So this lets you combine logical portions of queries. So imagine you wanted to find any headings inside of section, article, aside, and nav elements. I just picked some things at random. The query you would have had to write for that would have been section h1 comma, article h1 comma, aside h1 comma, nav h1. And that's because the comma only is a top level combiner. And so that meant you had to repeat all the rest of your query if that was the kind of query you were trying to make. However, with is, you can say, I want to match something that is these things. And it's h1. I shouldn't have put this dot there. My apologies. So you still get the h1, but only if it is preceded or only if its parentage contains one of those things. And so this can really simplify your queries too. And semantically, it can convey the meaning that isn't so obvious when you're looking at that. Or, obviously these are even reduced. So you would usually have some massive query combined with commas. This is some really nice stuff. Anyway, there was lots more. If you're interested in more of the things that happened, I have a big list of the reduced set of changes in the blog post. But we're not done yet. Of course, we're already looking forward to 10.0, and the 9.x development cycle is continuing. And so I hope to see you back here in another little bit and tell you about 10.0. And I don't know if I can give you questions given the system, right? Normally I end with questions, but I'm not sure I can take any unless Salva is able to relay them. If not, I've been very happy to talk to you. And please come see us on, we have a new GitHub discussion group if you go to the GitHub. And there's always IRC #mojo on Freenode. Yep, I can hear you. Salva?
Sweet. All right. So Q&A, that will be at a different place. And we have a Zoom room available for anybody else who has signed up at the meetup as we talked about. We can have, I can read some comments from YouTube here. Awesome stuff making a Docker file generator. Renaming over was +1.
It was always such a weird one. Over made no sense.
Ups and clapping. So it looks like at least the live audience like this. So thank you.
Glad to hear it. Thank you very much.
I think we'll be moving over to Zoom now. Just to give you guys a very quick finish here. The purpose of having the Zoom now and talking about it on the live stream is to make sure that anybody who watches this later gets the signal that you should really try to join us live, because this is like you get to be a part of the community, right?
An added benefit of
I hope you can find the time and opportunity next time we do something like this to join us, so we can hear you and perhaps see your face on Zoom.
All right, I'll see you guys over there.
Thank you, Joel Berger, and I hope this will turn out really nice on the stream.